The steady beep of the cardiac monitor filled the sterile silence of the ICU, its rhythmic sound cutting through the stillness like a drum beat, each pulse marking the seconds ticking away in a life-or-death dance. The air was thick, heavy with tension, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, unwilling to break the fragile balance between life and death. Aurora Lynn moved swiftly through the narrow corridors of Nightingale General Hospital, her footsteps echoing against the cold white floors. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed relentlessly, their harsh glow casting long, tired shadows on the walls. She had been on call for hours, the weight of exhaustion dragging her limbs, but she couldn't stop now. Not when every second counted. She had just finished a grueling shift, her mind already a blur of exhaustion when the call had come in. An urgent request for the best intensivist on staff. The words had been sharp, clipped, and devoid of any emotion. But Aurora had understood their significance. A high-profile patient, critical condition, a life hanging in the balance. Her hands gripped the edge of the cold metal doors as she reached the ICU, her heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and apprehension. Inside, chaos reigned. Medical staff shouted orders, their voices frantic, as they moved in unison to stabilize the patient who had arrived just moments earlier. Nurses bustled between machines, adjusting IV lines and checking monitors with practiced precision. Aurora's eyes scanned the room quickly, assessing the situation before stepping forward. And then, she saw him. Malachi Gray. The name was familiar, a constant in the headlines, his face gracing the cover of magazines for years, always a symbol of power, ambition, and untouchable success. CEO of Gray Tech Innovations, a man who had revolutionized industries and made billions. But now, lying motionless on the hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and wires, he was nothing more than a fragile human being, teetering on the edge of life. The glossy image of the self-made billionaire seemed worlds apart from the pale, sweat-slicked man before her, his chest barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. Aurora's mind flashed with fleeting thoughts, images of his corporate empire, his relentless drive for success, his reputation as a workaholic who never slowed down. But none of that mattered here. None of it could save him now. A breathless resident, wide-eyed and panicked, stumbled over the details. Severe cardiac complications, undetected infection, respiratory failure. They managed, their voice a mix of disbelief and fear. The situation was dire. Malachi had slipped beyond the point of no return before he'd even been wheeled into the hospital. His blood pressure was dangerously low, his heart rhythm erratic, and oxygen levels plummeting with each passing moment. The team had already started interventions, but there was no time to waste. Aurora's training kicked in, sharp and focused. She didn't have the luxury of hesitation or self-doubt. Lives were on the line, and every decision she made could mean the difference between life and death. She approached the bed with the calm professionalism that years of experience had etched into her, despite the unrelenting storm of worry brewing in her chest. Her mind raced as she reviewed the data flashing across the monitors. Everything screamed crisis. But there was no time to panic. She snapped out orders, her voice steady, her hands precise as she adjusted medication doses and instructed the team on the next steps. The room hummed with the tension of life-saving efforts. The air felt thick with urgency, and yet, in the midst of it all, a strange, quiet moment lingered. Between administering the next round of medications, Aurora allowed herself a fleeting moment to truly look at Malachi. Not the man in the headlines, not the billionaire tech mogul, but the man lying there, fighting for every breath. His features were softened now, free from the sharp lines of the powerful CEO who once seemed invincible. His once commanding presence had been reduced to a mere flicker of life, clinging to existence under the cold, fluorescent lights of a sterile hospital room. Aurora's heart twisted with an unexpected ache. Beneath the carefully crafted persona of wealth and success was a person, fragile, vulnerable, and for the first time in his life, powerless. Her eyes lingered on him, feeling an odd surge of empathy. The man who had built an empire with his own two hands, who had dominated boardrooms and changed the world, was now utterly helpless. And yet, he wasn't just any patient. Malachi Gray was a man with a reputation that stretched far beyond these hospital walls, a man whose influence could move mountains. And yet here he was, powerless against the unrelenting force of nature. Aurora's thoughts swirled, but there was no time to dwell on them. The crisis was far from over. As the hours ticked by, the battle continued. Machines beeped, nurses scurried, and Aurora held fast to her focus, pushing through exhaustion. Her body ached, but the adrenaline kept her going. She fought for him. Not because he was a CEO, not because he was some symbol of success, but because that's what she did. She saved lives. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the storm began to calm. Malachi's vitals plateaued. His heart stabilized, and his breathing became less labored. Slowly, the chaos of the ICU began to fade, the frantic energy dissipating as the team pulled back. The monitors now beeped in a slow, steady rhythm, a hopeful sign that he had crossed the threshold from life-threatening to stable. But even as the crisis passed, Aurora couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had shifted. She stood there, her chest tight with a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Malachi Gray, this titan of industry, was not out of the woods. He was stable, yes, but still teetering on the edge, and in the quiet that followed, Aurora felt a strange pull toward him. She didn't know what it was, this feeling of connection. Perhaps it was the shared experience of fighting death, or perhaps it was the strange vulnerability that had surfaced in him. But she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. As the nurses filed out, leaving Aurora alone in the room with Malachi, the weight of the moment settled in. She watched him closely, feeling a strange sense of responsibility for this man who was still so close to the edge. There was no telling what would happen next. Would he survive this? Would he wake up only to slip away again? And if he did survive, would he remember this night? Would he remember her? Her heart raced at the thought, a feeling she hadn't expected. She'd seen patients come and go, but there was something about Malachi Gray that stirred something deeper, inside her. Something she couldn't explain. And then, just as she was about to turn and leave, something unexpected happened. Malachi's hand twitched. His eyelids fluttered. And then, against all odds, his eyes opened. Aurora froze, the world around her narrowing down to that one, impossible moment. Malachi Gray, the man she had just assumed was on his way out of this world, was staring back at her. Alive, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had been so sure, so certain that he would be gone by now. And yet, here he was, looking at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. And just like that, the world around her seemed to shift. Aurora stepped into the ICU room, the hum of machines and the faint beeping of monitors filling her ears. The sterile white walls of the room seemed to close in around her as she assessed the situation with clinical precision, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. She had been through countless emergencies before, but nothing had quite prepared her for this. The patient lying before her was not just any patient. It was Malachi Gray, the CEO of Gray Tech Innovations, the man whose name had been synonymous with success, ambition, and innovation for years. A man who had built an empire, and now, here he was, vulnerable and teetering on the brink of death. Aurora's gaze fell on him, and for a moment, the sight struck her like a physical blow. Malachi lay motionless on the bed, connected to a maze of tubes and wires, his pale face a stark contrast to the powerful persona she had often seen on the covers of magazines. His once immaculate suit had been replaced with a hospital gown, his sharp features softened by the pallor of illness. His breathing was shallow, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor echoed ominously in the room, each beat a reminder of the delicate line he was walking between life and death. She could hear the muffled voices of the medical team around her, their words a blur of technical jargon, but her focus was solely on Malachi. The weight of the responsibility was overwhelming, but Aurora pushed it aside, her mind shifting into overdrive. Her training had prepared her for this. It had, too. "Dr. Lin," a nurse called out, her voice tense. "We've stabilized him for now, but he's still critical. The infection is spreading quickly, and his blood pressure is dangerously low." Aurora nodded, already moving toward the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't have time for hesitation. "What's his current status?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the anxiety twisting inside her. "His oxygen levels are dropping," the nurse replied. "We're trying to keep him stable, but we're not sure how much longer he can hold on." Aurora's eyes scanned the monitors as she mentally calculated the steps that needed to be taken. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she forced herself to focus. This wasn't just any patient. This was Malachi Gray, the man who had pushed boundaries in the tech world, who had shaped the future with his innovations. His name was known worldwide, a symbol of power and influence. But here, now, he was just another human being, lying vulnerable before her, depending on her to save his life. The pressure of it was suffocating. Aurora took a deep breath and moved into action. The first step was stabilizing his heart rate. She could see the erratic fluctuations on the monitor, a clear sign of distress. She barked orders at the team, and they sprang into motion. The room buzzed with frantic energy as they worked quickly to administer medication and adjust the ventilator settings. The clock was ticking, and every second mattered. "Increase the fluids," Aurora instructed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Get his blood pressure up before we lose him." The room became a flurry of activity as the nurses adjusted the IV lines and pushed medication. Aurora's hands moved with precision, checking the dosage, reviewing the lab results, and ensuring that every intervention was in place. The stakes couldn't have been higher. She knew that Malachi's life was hanging by a thread, and it was up to her to keep him from slipping away. As the minutes ticked by, Aurora couldn't help but think about the man behind the mask of power. Malachi Gray, the ruthless CEO, the business mogul who had never shown weakness. He had built his empire from the ground up, and now, here he was, fighting for his life in a sterile hospital room. She had heard the stories, the sleepless nights, the endless workdays, the obsession with perfection. He was known for pushing himself to the limit, for never backing down, for taking risks that others wouldn't dare. But none of that mattered here. In this room, none of his power or influence could save him. He was just another man fighting against the brutal force of nature. Aurora's chest tightened as she looked at him, her mind racing. She had always been focused on her work, on the science and the healing. But something about this moment, something about Malachi, stirred an unexpected ache in her heart. She couldn't put it into words, didn't want to. But there was a feeling she couldn't ignore, a strange connection, a sense of responsibility not just because he was her patient, but because for the first time, she felt the weight of his humanity. She shook her head, trying to focus. Now wasn't the time to be distracted by her emotions. Malachi needed her to be focused, to be the doctor who would pull him through this crisis. The seconds dragged into minutes, and with each passing moment, the tension in the room mounted. Aurora felt as if the air itself was charged with anticipation. Every breath Malachi took was a small victory, but every beep of the monitor reminded her just how fragile that victory was. The line between life and death was razor thin, and they were walking it together. As Aurora worked, her mind couldn't help but wander. Why was he here? How had this happened? Malachi had never been known for weakness, for letting anything slip through his fingers. He was a man who controlled his world with an iron grip. So how had he ended up here, on the edge of death? Aurora tried to push the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. But even as she worked, the question gnawed at her. Was this the cost of ambition? The price of pushing oneself too far? She had seen it before. The toll that relentless ambition could take on the body, the mind. But she had never imagined it could bring down someone like Malachi Gray. Her eyes flicked to the clock. They had been working for over an hour now, the initial panic starting to subside as Malachi's vitals stabilized. But the battle was far from over. His breathing was still shallow, his body still fighting the infection that had taken root so quickly. The worst wasn't over yet. Aurora wiped the sweat from her forehead and took a step back to assess the situation. The tension in her body was palpable, every muscle straining with the effort to hold on to control. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now. Not when he was so close to slipping away. In the silence of the room, with only the beeping of the monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital echoing through the walls, Aurora felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness wash over her. No matter how many times she had been in this position, it never got easier. The weight of responsibility, the lives in her hands, was a constant companion. But that didn't make it any less suffocating. "How is he?" a voice asked from behind her, pulling her back to the present. Aurora turned to see Dr. Harris, the head of the ICU, standing in the doorway. His eyes were filled with concern, but there was no time for pleasantries. "Stabilized for now," Aurora replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "But he's still critical. We need to keep monitoring his oxygen levels and keep his blood pressure from dropping again." Dr. Harris nodded, stepping into the room to assist. The two of them worked in tandem, fine-tuning the various machines and adjusting medications. But even as they did so, the gravity of the situation hung heavy in the air. Malachi Gray, the indomitable CEO, was lying in front of them, his future uncertain. And Aurora couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. This crisis wasn't just about saving a patient. It was about something much bigger. Something that might change everything. As the minutes dragged on, Aurora couldn't help but think about the world outside these walls. The world where Malachi was a king, a titan, a man who ruled with ruthless precision. How many lives had he touched with his decisions? How many people depended on him? And yet, in this room, he was just another patient, vulnerable and fragile. For a fleeting moment, Aurora wondered if he would survive this. Would he pull through and reclaim his place in the world? Or would this be the end of his story? Would he remember her, this anonymous doctor who fought to save his life? Or would she simply fade into the background of his remarkable journey? The tension in the room was palpable as they continued their work, each second feeling like an eternity. Malachi's fate was still uncertain, and Aurora's heart raced with the knowledge that everything she did in this moment could decide whether or not he made it through. The weight of it all pressed down on her, but she knew there was no room for doubt. She couldn't afford to fail him. Not now. Not when he was so close to slipping away. Aurora stood frozen, her hands hovering just above the medical equipment, eyes glued to the monitors that blinked back at her with an unforgiving rhythm. Malachi's heart rate had slowed. His blood pressure had dropped dangerously low again. The oxygen levels, those numbers that had seemed like lifelines mere minutes, were now declining at an alarming rate. The machines that were supposed to sustain him had become her only connection to him, the only tether to this man who, with each passing second, seemed to slip further from her grasp. She took a steadying breath, but it did little to calm the tremor in her chest. A doctor's mind should always stay detached. It was the cornerstone of her profession. A person couldn't save lives while being consumed by emotions, lost in the weight of human fragility. She knew this. And yet, standing in the sterile silence of the ICU, with Malachi Gray lying so still, she could feel the walls of professionalism begin to crack. This wasn't just any patient. This was Malachi Gray, the man who had once filled every headline with tales of his success, his unrelenting drive. The man who had seemed so invincible, and yet here he was, lying before her, fighting to draw breath, his life hanging in the balance. Aurora's mind was clouded with conflicting thoughts. She was a doctor. Her duty was clear. Save him, keep him alive, no matter the cost. But in the silence of the room, as the monitors continued their mournful beeps, a different, more visceral part of her took over. She couldn't remember when it had happened. But somewhere between the chaos of the night and the mounting tension, a feeling had begun to grow. A feeling of deep responsibility, not just as his doctor, but as a human being who had been touched by his vulnerability. It wasn't just the illness that had made Malachi fragile. It was the fact that she had seen him, just for a moment, as something other than the man the world had shaped him into. Beneath the bravado and the power, he was human, vulnerable, just like everyone else. And in that moment, as the room seemed to press in around her, Aurora could feel the weight of it. The weight of a life slipping away, a life that, despite all its success, was now dependent on a machine and the will of a single person. Her heart pounded in her chest as she leaned forward, her fingers brushing his damp forehead. His skin was cold to the touch, clammy from the sweat that coated his body. For a moment, she closed her eyes, blocking out the rest of the world around her. The rhythmic beeping, the busy nurses rushing to and fro, the sterile smell of antiseptic, everything faded. All that mattered was the man lying before her, a man who had, until now, existed in a realm far removed from the vulnerability of a hospital bed. It was as if her breath was caught in her throat, held hostage by the overwhelming reality that she might lose him here, in this sterile room, alone. For a brief, fleeting moment, she let her guard down. And in that moment of quiet surrender, something deep inside her, urged her to do the unthinkable. She leaned in, her pulse racing as she slowly moved closer to Malachi. She had never let herself get so close, not with any patient, not with anyone. But here, now, in the stillness of the ICU, the boundaries between them seemed to disappear. The professional mask she had worn for so long slipped away as her emotions rushed to the surface. Her breath hitched in her throat, and before she could stop herself, her lips gently brushed his forehead. A fleeting kiss. It was nothing more than a whisper of warmth against cold skin, but in that brief moment, time seemed to stand still. It was as if the universe held its breath, as if the world outside ceased to exist. She could feel the heat of her own cheeks flush as she pulled away, her heart pounding loudly in her chest. Her rational mind screamed at her, telling her that she had crossed a line, that she should never have allowed herself to do this. But her emotions, her empathy, had taken over. It wasn't about his fame, or his fortune, or his reputation. It was about something deeper, something raw and human. The kiss was a silent goodbye, a gesture of compassion for a man she believed was slipping away forever. She pulled back quickly, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she tried to regain control. The room around her seemed to close in, the beeping of the machines growing louder, more insistent. Aurora's mind was in chaos, torn between her professional duty and the overwhelming surge of emotions she couldn't suppress. She should have been clinical. She should have been strong. But in that moment, as her lips had lingered against his forehead, she had allowed herself to feel something more than just the sterile duty of a doctor. She had allowed herself to care, to feel. Her hands trembled as she reached for the IV line, adjusting the medication dosage. But her mind was still tangled in the kiss. In the moment when she had believed she was bidding him farewell, she could feel the heat still lingering on her lips, the unexpected tenderness of the act, and it unsettled her. Why had she done it? Why had she allowed herself to cross that boundary? The kiss had been meant as a final act of compassion, a gesture to offer some small comfort in his final moments. But the moment her lips had met his skin, something had shifted inside her. A spark, a warmth, a feeling she couldn't ignore. Her mind raced as she stepped back, hands working mechanically to stabilize his vitals. The kiss was nothing more than an impulse, a fleeting act in the midst of chaos. Yet, it lingered. Her heart still thudded in her chest, the echo of the kiss reverberating through her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Doctors didn't kiss their patients. They didn't form connections like that. It was unprofessional, irresponsible. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the kiss had meant something more. Had it been a last act of humanity? Or was it something deeper? Something more complicated than she cared to admit? As she worked to keep Malachi stable, she couldn't push away the thoughts swirling in her mind. She had seen patients fight for their lives, and she had been part of many battles against death, but this felt different. Malachi Gray was more than just a patient to her. His life had become intertwined with hers in a way she hadn't expected. And as she adjusted the monitors, watched the machines pulse with each beat of his heart, Aurora knew one thing with unsettling clarity. That moment, that kiss, would change everything. She stepped back, trying to steady herself, but her mind was still reeling. She couldn't let her emotions get the best of her. Not now. Not when Malachi's life was hanging by a thread. But even as she focused on her work, she knew she had crossed a line, and she wasn't sure if she could ever return to the place she had been before. That kiss was the final act of compassion, but it also marked the beginning of something entirely new. A connection that neither she nor Malachi could have foreseen. As the minutes passed, Aurora continued her work, her hands moving with mechanical precision, but her heart was no longer the same. The kiss had altered something in her, something fundamental. She couldn't help but wonder if Malachi had felt it too, if the warmth she had given him had reached him in some way, even as he drifted between life and death. Would he remember her when he woke up? Would he understand the depth of the gesture? She had made a simple kiss that had meant so much more than she had ever intended. And just as she was lost in her thoughts, the unexpected happened. The monitor's beeping slowed, its frantic rhythm shifting to a steady pulse. Aurora looked at it, her breath catching in her throat. Could it be? Had he made it through? She took a step closer to the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Malachi's chest rose and fell slightly more steadily now, and his face, still pale, still marked by the battle he had fought, seemed to relax, just a little. It was a faint sign, but it was enough. Aurora leaned down, her eyes searching his, for any sign of consciousness. It was just a flicker, a subtle change in his expression, but it was enough to make her heart leap. The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, something inside her stirred, something powerful, something undeniable. She wasn't just fighting to save a life, she was fighting for the possibility of a future that she couldn't yet understand, but that she knew had somehow been set in motion by a single, unspoken moment. As Malachi's shallow breaths continued, Aurora stood by his side, waiting, hoping, and wondering what would come next. Aurora had barely left his side, her hand still hovering near the monitors, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Malachi's chest. The room was quieter now, the frantic buzz of the ICU settling into a more manageable hum. She could feel the exhaustion in her limbs, the lingering weight of the night pressing down on her shoulders, but she couldn't bring herself to leave just yet, not while he was still fighting. Not while the uncertainty of his survival was hanging. like a fragile thread. She stood there, breathing in the sterile, antiseptic air, the quiet sounds of the hospital filling the space between her and the man who had dominated the headlines for years, but who now lay so still, so vulnerable. She couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. It had been so fleeting, so instinctive, but it had felt like a mark on the edge of her soul. She had kissed him thinking it might be the last thing she could do. But now, as he continued to fight, to hang on, what did it mean? Did he even remember it? The thought gnawed at her. She had done it out of compassion, out of a deep human need to offer him some comfort in his final moments. Yet the consequences of that simple, intimate gesture seemed to be weighing on her more heavily with each passing second. But then, just as the room seemed to settle into an uneasy quiet, the unexpected happened. Malachi's eyelids fluttered. His chest, which had been rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths, suddenly heaved in a deeper, more controlled motion. Aurora's heart leaped into her throat, and for a moment she thought she was imagining it. But no, he was waking, up. He was alive. Her breath hitched as she stepped closer to him, her pulse quickening with the realization that this man, this formidable figure who had seemed so close to death, was actually coming back to life. The color was still drained from his face, his features gaunt, but there was a flicker of awareness in his eyes as they began to open, his gaze sluggish and unfocused at first, then slowly narrowing as he became aware of the room around him. The intensity in those eyes was immediate, unmistakable. Malachi was back. Where am I? His voice was weak, strained, a raw rasp that made her chest tighten. "You're in the hospital," Aurora answered, her voice softer than she intended, betraying the relief she felt. "You've been in critical condition, but you're stable. Now." Malachi blinked slowly, trying to focus, his eyes struggling to clear. His hand twitched, and his fingers, still stiff and uncoordinated from the sedatives, brushed across the blanket. Aurora stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to say, unsure of what he might remember, or what he might not. He turned his head, his gaze finding hers. There was a moment of stillness, as if time itself had paused. Aurora's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to wake up. And certainly not so suddenly, so sharply. For a long, lingering moment, they stared at each other. Two souls who had briefly brushed against death, now facing the strange quiet of life that had somehow found a way to continue. Malachi's eyes searched hers, and she could see the flicker of confusion, the struggle to process what had happened, what was real. You saved me," he whispered, his voice faint, fragile. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. I remember you." Aurora froze. Her heartbeat seemed to stutter in her chest, and for a moment her mind spun, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. Did he remember? Did he remember that moment, the kiss? The gesture that had meant so much to her, but might have been nothing more than an unconscious instinct for him? She stumbled over her words. I just did my job. I was doing what any doctor would have done. Malachi's lips parted, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his mouth, though it was barely a ghost of his usual self-assured grin. "No, you did more than that. You stayed with me. After everyone else left, you didn't give up on me." The sincerity in his voice stirred something deep inside her, but it only made her feel more conflicted. She had stayed because she was a doctor, because that's what she did, but also because somewhere deep inside she couldn't bear to leave him. She couldn't explain it, but it was as though something had reached out to her in the silence of that room, something she hadn't expected, something she didn't know how to handle. She forced a small, tight-lipped smile. "It's my job, to save lives, Mr. Gray." He gave a weak, but amused chuckle. "Malachi," he corrected softly. You don't need to be so formal with me. Aurora paused. His gaze held hers. Intense, searching. There was something raw in his eyes. Something she hadn't seen in him before. Something vulnerable. It caught her off guard, the shift in his demeanor. He wasn't the powerful, unyielding CEO now. He was just a man, a fragile man in a hospital bed, looking at her with a sense of gratitude that she hadn't expected. The room seemed to close in on her. She could feel the emotions swirling around them. Tension, unspoken words, and the undeniable weight of what had just happened between them. What had happened? She couldn't push the thought away. The kiss, the one she had given him. Not as a doctor, but as a human, caught up in the gravity of the moment, kept replaying in her mind, and she didn't know how to face him now. Would he remember? Would he question it? His voice broke through her thoughts. Thank you, Malachi said, his words quiet but filled with so much meaning. For everything. For not giving up on me. The simple gratitude in his voice made her heart ache. She had done so much more than simply save his life. She had been a witness to his vulnerability, to his mortality, and now, standing before him, she wasn't sure where the line between professional and personal ended. I'm just glad you're okay, she managed, though the words felt hollow, like a mask she had put on to hide the truth. There was more to it than just her role as his doctor. But she couldn't say it. She couldn't admit the depth of the emotional complexity that had built up between them in the last few hours. Malachi seemed to sense her discomfort, though he didn't speak of it directly. He closed his eyes for a moment, his hand resting weakly on the bed, and when he opened them again, his gaze softened. You stayed with me even when I thought I was going to die. I don't know how to repay you for that, but I need you to know. You did more than just save my life. You gave me something I didn't know I needed. Aurora swallowed hard. She felt her throat tighten as his words landed in the air between them. There it was. The connection she hadn't expected. The thread between them that she couldn't explain. She had done what she thought was necessary, but he had read it as something more, something deeper. But what did it mean? And more. Importantly, what would happen now? Aurora hesitated, the words catching in her throat. I didn't do it for any other reason than to help you, to make sure you were comfortable. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. There had been something more, something unspoken, pushing her to act in that moment. And now, as Malachi's gaze lingered on her, she couldn't help but wonder what he saw in her, what he might think about the kiss that had occurred between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, the silence loud and heavy in the space between them. Aurora could feel her heart racing as she tried to sort through her emotions, but there was no clear answer. She couldn't explain it to him. She couldn't even explain it to herself. And as she looked at him, still pale but alive, still weak but breathing, she couldn't help but wonder how their lives would be shaped by this moment, by the life they had both almost lost, and the strange, undeniable connection that had been forged in its aftermath. It felt like everything had changed in an instant. But where would it go from here? Would Malachi remember the kiss? Would he understand why she had done it? Or would he simply see it as a fleeting moment, a gesture from a doctor to a patient, and move on? Aurora didn't know. But as she stood, there, her pulse still quickening, the uncertainty hung in the air between them, like the fragile thread of life itself. Unpredictable, delicate, and yet somehow stronger than either of them could have anticipated. Aurora sat at the edge of Malachi's bed, her mind racing with questions she hadn't been able to shake off since he had woken up. The soft beeping of the heart monitor had become a dull backdrop to the increasingly sharp thoughts that cut through her focus. Malachi was stable, but the relief she had felt earlier had quickly faded, replaced by an unsettling sense of dread. The more she thought about the circumstances that had led to his near-death experience, the more she couldn't shake the suspicion that something was wrong, something deeper than just a simple medical crisis. Malachi, though still weak and recovering, had been lucid enough to engage in conversation. Yet, there was something in his voice, a quiet unease, that suggested he had his own suspicions about how everything had unfolded. Aurora looked down at the papers in her lap, the results from the latest round of tests. They were nothing short of troubling. The lab reports showed clear signs of abnormalities, signs that didn't align with the typical progression of the severe infection he had been diagnosed with. His blood work, initially dismissed as the collateral damage of his critical condition, was now starting to tell a different story. The medications he had been administered, particularly the powerful antibiotics and sedatives, had been far more potent than necessary. There were discrepancies in the dosages, and the more she pored over the records, the more the dots seemed to connect. Aurora knew what this meant. Someone had tampered with his treatment. Her heart sank as she looked back at Malachi, who was still recovering in the bed. He was staring out the window now, looking distant. He had been unusually quiet since his earlier words of gratitude. She had no doubt that his mind was working in overdrive, trying to make sense of the events that had nearly stolen his life. "I've been looking over your charts," Aurora said softly, her voice tentative. "And there are some inconsistencies. I think someone might have tampered with your medications." Malachi's head whipped toward her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "You think someone did this on purpose?" he asked, his voice hoarse but steady. Aurora nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of the medical papers in her lap. "It's more than just a mistake or error in judgment. The dosages, they were too high, much higher than what was necessary. It looks like someone intentionally manipulated your treatment, perhaps even exacerbated the infection. If we dig deeper, we might find evidence of it." Malachi's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. For a moment, he said nothing, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "This isn't just a coincidence, is it?" His voice had a bite to it now, a reflection of the anger and betrayal that was beginning to take root. "Someone wanted me out of the picture." Aurora could hear the cold certainty in his voice. She had worked with enough patience to know that the idea of intentional harm wasn't something anyone wanted to entertain, let alone accept. But in this case, the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. "Malachi," she hesitated, unsure how to navigate the delicate nature of their conversation. "I think someone in your own company, or possibly even in the hospital, might be behind this." The words seemed to hang in the air, and Malachi let out a deep breath, staring at her, his expression unreadable. "This is bigger than we thought," he murmured, almost to himself. Aurora watched him closely, the realization settling into her gut. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a man with enemies, powerful ones, and that was a dangerous game for them both. "I'll help you," Aurora said, her voice quiet but firm. "We can go through the records, find out who administered those meds, and why. If there's foul play involved, we need to expose it." Malachi's eyes softened, his lips curling into a faint smile, but it was tinged with something more. Something like a reluctant admiration for the woman who had become his lifeline, both literally and figuratively. "You're not just a doctor, are you?" he asked, his voice holding a note of something akin to respect. "You're willing to risk everything for the truth. For me." Aurora's breath caught in her throat. His words were a strange combination of gratitude and something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite place. Was it a recognition of something she hadn't yet fully acknowledged? Something more than just duty? "I'm doing what's right," she replied, her voice steady, but unsure. "It's my responsibility." Malachi gave a weak nod, clearly exhausted, but there was a fire in his eyes. "I've built a company, an empire, and made enemies every step of the way. I won't let them get away with this, not when it comes to my life. And I won't let anyone try to destroy you either." Aurora swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy cloak. She had known the stakes would be high, but this was something she hadn't expected. To find herself caught up in something so dangerous, so deeply intertwined, with corporate greed, with power plays that stretched far beyond the sterile confines of the hospital walls. And yet, there was something in Malachi's words, in the quiet determination that now shone through his weakened state, that made her want to push forward. The stakes were high, yes, but the truth was even higher. They couldn't let this go. Not when someone had intentionally put his life at risk. "I won't back down either," Aurora said, her voice low but resolute. "We'll find who did this." But even as she spoke those words, doubt began to creep in, threading its way through her thoughts. This wasn't going to be easy. She knew it. The forces they were up against, both in the hospital and in the business world, were powerful, ruthless. They would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Aurora glanced at Malachi, who was now sitting up slightly in the bed, propped up by pillows. His face was still pale, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. He was awake now, not just physically, but mentally, fully aware of the battle ahead. And Aurora knew, with unsettling certainty, that this was just the beginning. They had to be careful. They couldn't let anyone know they were investigating this. Too many eyes were watching, too many people with their own agendas. The hospital, the company. Everyone had something to gain or lose, and one wrong move could spell disaster for both of them. Malachi's voice broke through her thoughts. "Whoever did this, whoever's behind it, they won't stop just because. We know we're going to have to play this carefully." Aurora nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had known this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing him say it out loud made everything feel much more real, much more dangerous. "We need to gather the evidence without alerting anyone. I'll start with the medical records. We can track down who had access to your medications, who was responsible for your care, and look for any anomalies." Malachi's lips pressed into a thin line. "And we need to find out who has the motive," he added. "Someone wanted me out of the way. This wasn't just an accident." Aurora agreed, though the unease in her stomach grew. She had no idea who might be behind this, but she knew one thing for certain. It wasn't just some corporate sabotage. It was personal. As they began to formulate their plan, the tension in the room only grew. Every decision they made had consequences. Every step forward in their investigation would bring them closer to the truth, and closer to the dangers lurking in the shadows. Aurora couldn't help but wonder who would stop at nothing to see Malachi Gray fall, and who would be willing to go to even darker lengths to make sure that their secret remained hidden. The path ahead was unclear. But one thing was certain. They were no longer just fighting for Malachi's life. They were fighting for something much bigger, something that would change everything. And both of them knew, deep down, that there would be no turning back. In the weeks that followed the crisis, a subtle transformation began to unfold in the quiet corridors of Nightingale General Hospital. A transformation that neither Aurora nor Malachi could have predicted. The sterile beeps of the monitors and the fluorescent glare of the ICU had, for a brief time, given way to something altogether more personal, something that tugged at the very core of their beings. Aurora found herself lingering by Malachi's bedside long after the urgent tasks had subsided. In the quiet moments of the early morning, when the chaos of the hospital faded into a soft murmur, she would sit in the dim light and simply watch him sleep, His face, still marked with the pallor of recent battle, now bore a gentle vulnerability that stirred emotions within her. It was as if the formidable CEO, whose name had once been synonymous with power and control, had been unmasked, revealing a fragile soul beneath. One particularly soft-lit evening, as dusk settled over the city and cast long shadows across the hospital floor, Aurora sat beside Malachi with a cup of lukewarm tea. The rhythmic hum of the machines provided a steady soundtrack, while the soft murmur of the hospital outside barely penetrated the room's intimate silence. Malachi's eyes, though still tired, were open and filled with a depth that seemed to speak of unspoken truths. He looked at her with a gentle curiosity, and in that shared moment, the distance between patient and doctor dissolved into something indescribably tender. "You stayed with me," Malachi whispered, his voice rough but sincere. His hand, weak, yet determined, reached out to graze her fingertips, a silent thank you, laden with meaning. Aurora's heart fluttered at the contact. She knew the ethical boundaries she was meant to uphold, the professional distance that every doctor was taught to maintain. Yet, in that moment, the rules of the sterile, clinical world melted away, replaced by a raw, undeniable connection that neither could ignore. Aurora's mind churned with conflicting thoughts. As a physician, she was trained to be detached, to focus solely on saving lives, without allowing personal feelings to complicate her judgment. But here, in the hushed glow of the hospital room, her professional armor felt less like a shield and more like a cage. The crisis they had both survived had kindled something fragile and beautiful, a budding love that defied the rigid lines of duty and decorum. Days turned into nights, and each encounter brought them closer. Malachi, now slowly regaining his strength, began to share pieces of his world with Aurora. Between moments of therapy and careful monitoring, he recounted stories of boardroom battles and triumphs that had built his empire. But his voice, once so commanding and resolute, now trembled with the weight of his recent ordeal. There was a softness in his tone when he spoke of his ambitions, a vulnerability that belied the cold, calculating image painted by the media. Aurora listened intently, her gaze fixed on him as if to memorize every detail. In his eyes, she saw not just the remnants of a powerful CEO, but a man stripped bare by the harsh realities of mortality. Each story he told wove a tapestry of experiences that were as thrilling as they were tragic, and Aurora found herself captivated by the man behind the headlines. It wasn't merely admiration. It was an awakening of emotions she had long suppressed, a recognition that love could emerge in the most unlikely of places. One quiet afternoon, as soft sunlight filtered through the window blinds, casting delicate patterns across the room, Malachi and Aurora found themselves alone in a moment of fragile intimacy. Aurora was reviewing his latest test results on a clipboard, her eyes scanning the figures with practiced precision, when Malachi cleared his throat. He shifted slightly in the bed, and for a heartbeat, the distance between them seemed to vanish. Their eyes met, a silent conversation unfolding in the space between glances. "You saved me more than once, Aurora," Malachi said softly, his gaze searching hers as though he were trying to read her very soul. "Not just my body, but my spirit." His words, tender and laden with gratitude, sent a shiver through her. In that moment, Aurora felt the raw pull of her emotions, a mix of professional pride and personal affection that was growing stronger with every passing day. But as quickly as the warmth arose, a cold current of doubt would follow. Aurora's heart wrestled with the ethics of her position. She was a healer, bound by codes that demanded objectivity and detachment. Every tender glance, every soft-spoken word, seemed to pull her deeper into a labyrinth of emotions that she was neither sure she wanted nor was allowed to have. The more Malachi confided in her, the more she struggled with the guilt of letting her guard down. Was it possible to separate the woman who cared deeply from the doctor who was duty-bound? To save lives? The question haunted her, leaving her sleepless in the quiet hours of the night. One evening, after a particularly long day filled with emergency calls and whispered reassurances in the ICU, Aurora found herself in the hospital's small garden, a rare, quiet space away from the relentless demands of her work. The garden, bathed in the soft light of twilight, offered a brief respite from the relentless pace of her duties. As she sat on a weathered bench, her mind was awash with conflicting thoughts. The cool breeze offered little comfort against the heat of her inner turmoil. The memory of Malachi's eyes, the unspoken bond that had grown between them, tugged at her heart, making her wonder if she could ever fully reclaim the professional distance that she was supposed to maintain. In the days that followed, subtle moments of tenderness continued to weave their way into their interactions. In the lull between treatment rounds, Malachi would catch Aurora's eye, and for an instant, the chaotic world around them would fade into the background. There were times when he would reach out with a smile that was both weary and hopeful, a smile that spoke of unspoken promises and shared battles. And in those moments, Aurora's resolve would falter, her carefully constructed walls of professionalism crumbling ever so slightly in the face of something far more potent than duty. Yet with every stolen glance, with every whispered word in the dark, the tension between them deepened. Aurora began to realize that what she felt was not merely an impulse born from the adrenaline of a crisis, but something far more enduring. Love, a tender, fragile love that grew from the ashes of near tragedy and the vulnerability of two souls laid bare in the quiet hours of a hospital room. And yet, the realization filled her with dread as much as it did with hope. For in loving him, she risked not only her own heart, but also the very integrity of her calling. One night, as rain began to patter softly against the hospital windows, Aurora found herself once again at Malachi's bedside. The storm outside mirrored the tumult within her. Malachi was awake, his eyes heavy with fatigue, but glistening with an unmistakable tenderness whenever they met hers. The steady rhythm of the rain provided a melancholic counterpoint to the unspoken words that hung between them. "Do you ever think," Malachi began quietly, his voice hesitant, "that sometimes the most dangerous battles we fight are not against our enemies, but within ourselves?" His eyes searched hers, seeking an answer that went beyond words. Aurora's heart clenched at the sincerity in his tone. "Every day," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Sometimes I wonder if I can keep my heart out of this, if I can maintain the distance I'm supposed to." Malachi reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed against hers. A touch so light it might have been imagined, yet it spoke volumes of the connection that had been forged in the crucible of their shared crisis. "But what if," he continued, his voice soft yet firm, "what if that distance is exactly what we need to protect ourselves? And what if in breaking that barrier, we find a strength we never knew existed?" The words hung in the air, laden with possibility and risk. Aurora's pulse quickened, torn between the pull of her professional ethics and the undeniable allure of a love that promised to fill the emptiness left by years of solitude and duty. In that tender, rain-soaked moment, the walls she had built around her heart trembled, ready to collapse under the weight of something new, something dangerous, yet beautiful. As the night deepened, the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them and the unspoken understanding that something profound was taking shape. Each touch, each shared glance, was a quiet rebellion against the constraints of their roles, a subtle defiance of the rules that dictated how a doctor should behave. For Aurora, every beat of her heart now carried the echo of that defiant tenderness, a reminder that love, even in its most fragile form, was worth the risk. In the days that followed, their encounters grew more charged with meaning. During routine checkups and quiet moments in the recovery room, Malachi's hand would linger a little longer on Aurora's, their eyes meeting in a silent conversation that needed no words. They shared smiles that were both wistful and resolute, knowing that every stolen moment could never be fully theirs, but that, for now, it was enough. But beneath the gentle unfolding of their connection lay an undercurrent of tension, a constant reminder that what they were doing was dangerous. Aurora wrestled with the conflict that gnawed at her, the duty to her profession versus the undeniable pull of her heart. Each time she looked into Malachi's eyes, she saw not only gratitude and hope, but also the reflection of her own vulnerability. The realization was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. One evening, after a particularly trying day marked by emergencies and frantic calls, Aurora found herself alone with Malachi in a dimly lit consultation room. The world outside was far away, and for a brief, suspended moment, they allowed themselves to be free from the constraints of roles and expectations. Malachi's voice was soft, almost a whisper, as he confessed, "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be so utterly dependent on someone, not just for my life, but for my heart." Aurora's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice trembling with the weight of the confession. "Every time I look at you, I'm reminded that life is so fragile and that every moment counts. I'm scared of what this might mean for both of us." Malachi's hand reached out, gently covering hers, an unspoken vow of solidarity. "I'm scared too," he said, his tone raw and honest. "But maybe this is what we need. A chance to feel, to truly live, even if it means risking everything we know." Their words were a balm and a spark all at once, a promise of hope that cut through the darkness of their fears. In that quiet space, as they sat together with their hearts laid bare, Aurora realized that love was not just a fleeting emotion born of crisis. It was a transformative force that could heal the deepest wounds, that could bridge the gap between duty and desire. Yet even as their bond grew, the reality of their situation loomed large. They were still in a hospital, surrounded by reminders of the fragility of life and the ever-present specter of responsibility. Aurora knew that every tender moment they shared was also a challenge to the ethical boundaries she had once held sacred. It was a dangerous dance, a delicate balance between vulnerability and professional integrity. But in that dance, she found a freedom she had long denied herself, a freedom that promised to reshape not only her life, but perhaps, in time, even the future they might build together. As the weeks passed, their relationship became a series of quiet revolutions, a series of small yet profound moments that redefined who they were. From the soft laughter that filled the gaps between clinical conversations to the lingering touches that spoke of unspoken promises, every day was a testament to the delicate, defiant power of love in the midst of uncertainty. Aurora often found herself lost in thought during long shifts, her mind drifting to the gentle warmth of Malachi's gaze, to the soft brush of his hand on hers. In those moments, she wondered if this was more than just a romantic rebellion against the world's cold pragmatism. Perhaps, she thought, it was a rediscovery of her own humanity, a reclaiming of the parts of her heart that had been locked away in the name of duty and decorum. And so, amidst the relentless beeping of machines and the constant hum of hospital life, a tender revolution was taking root. It was a revolution that promised both hope and heartache, a revolution that dared to challenge the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Aurora and Malachi, bound together by fate and forged in the crucible of near death, had found in each other a beacon, a light that shone even in the darkest of nights, guiding them towards a future that was as uncertain as it was beautiful. In the quiet intimacy of those stolen moments, as they exchanged glances filled with longing and promise, Aurora began to understand that some connections were meant to defy logic and reason, and though the path ahead was fraught with danger and the risk of shattering everything they had built, she knew deep down that the love blossoming between them was a truth worth fighting for. The revelation came on a stormy Thursday afternoon, when the usual sterile hum of Nightingale General Hospital was disrupted by a series of urgent whispers and furtive glances exchanged among the staff. Aurora had been reviewing the latest lab results in her small office when a knock at the door startled her. It was Dr. Ramirez, a trusted colleague whose normally calm demeanor was tinged with anxiety. "Aurora, you need to see this," he said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "I've uncovered something unsettling." Flipping through the pages, Aurora's heart pounded as she read detailed records showing inexplicable discrepancies in Malachi Gray's medication dosages, irregular numbers that didn't align with standard protocols. There were even notes written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting that hinted at unauthorized alterations. The data pointed toward deliberate tampering, not simple human error. "Someone's been manipulating his treatment," she murmured, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This isn't a mistake. It's sabotage." Outside, the thunder rumbled as if echoing her sentiments. Aurora's mind raced. Her thoughts shifted from clinical calculations to the sinister possibility that these irregularities might not be confined to the hospital. Could it be that the corporate world, Malachi's own empire, had infiltrated even the sacred halls of medicine? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Aurora arranged a discreet meeting with Malachi later that evening. In his private hospital suite, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Malachi, still recovering but now more alert, sat upright, in bed, his eyes sharp and filled with a burning determination that belied his physical frailty. "Aurora," he began, his voice low and steady. "I've been receiving disturbing reports. My board is whispering about irregularities, not just in my treatment, but also in our financial records and internal communications at Gray Tech." He paused, searching her face for a sign of understanding. "It seems like someone is working against me on all fronts." Aurora nodded slowly. "The lab reports I saw this afternoon suggest deliberate manipulation of your medication. I believe there's a conspiracy here that extends beyond a hospital error. Someone, or some group, has orchestrated this attack to weaken you, to discredit you." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady patter of rain against the window. Malachi's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward. "Do you think it's coming from within the company? Or could it be that someone on the hospital staff is in on it?" Aurora's gaze hardened. "I don't know yet, but the evidence suggests a level of coordination that points to a calculated plan. If it's within Gray Tech, then you're dealing with traitors in your own ranks. And if it's inside the hospital, then it means the betrayal goes even deeper." Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the entrance of Cyrus Alden, Malachi's trusted yet enigmatic CFO, whose presence immediately transformed the mood. He strode into the room with an air of controlled hostility, his eyes flickering between Malachi and Aurora. The tension was palpable, a clash of interests that seemed destined to ignite. "Malachi, I've been informed that you've been discussing internal discrepancies with Dr. Lin," Cyrus said, his tone clipped and accusatory. "Is this true? Are you trying to undermine the board?" Malachi's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and defiance. "I'm trying to uncover the truth, Cyrus. Something is very wrong, and I won't sit back while my life and my company are being sabotaged." Cyrus's jaw tightened, and he fixed Aurora with a cold stare. "You're a doctor, Aurora. Your role is to treat patients, not to involve yourself in corporate affairs. If you continue down this path, you risk more than just your career." Aurora met his gaze steadily, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm here because I believe that the health of a patient is interconnected with every facet of his life. Malachi's condition isn't just a medical issue. It's part of a larger scheme of betrayal and manipulation. If we don't find out who's behind this, more lives could be at risk." A heavy silence fell over the room. The confrontation between Malachi and Cyrus was more than a clash of professional opinions. It was a battle for control over a truth that had the power to shatter empires. Cyrus's eyes burned with an intensity that bordered on hatred, while Malachi's expression was a blend of determination and vulnerability. After a tense moment, Cyrus finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "I suggest you leave this discussion. To the board, Malachi. Your reckless pursuit of this truth could ruin everything we've built." Malachi's response was immediate, his tone icy. "I built this company on the foundation of integrity, Cyrus, and I will not allow you or anyone else to destroy that, especially not by silencing the very people who are trying to help me." Aurora felt the room tighten around them like a vice. The stakes had just escalated, and it was clear that the conspiracy was far more intricate and treacherous than she had ever imagined. In that charged moment, as harsh words were exchanged and accusations flared, the true nature of the betrayal began to unravel before her eyes. Later that night, after Cyrus had stormed out in a huff, Aurora and Malachi sat alone in the dim light of his suite. The room was shrouded in shadows, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder and the soft, rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Malachi's face, usually so guarded and stoic, was now open with raw emotion as he turned to her. "Who can we trust?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "Everywhere I look, I see suspicion. I fear that the people I once considered allies are orchestrating my downfall." Aurora reached out, her hand gently covering his. "We'll figure it out," she promised, her voice steady, despite the turmoil churning inside her. "We'll follow every lead, cross every piece of evidence. I'll use every resource I have, both in the hospital and beyond, to uncover the truth." Malachi's eyes softened with gratitude and a trace of something deeper, a spark of hope in the midst of the darkness. "I'm glad you're by my side, Aurora. I don't know what I'd do without you." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but even as she squeezed his hand, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She knew that the road ahead was fraught with peril. The conspiracy they were unraveling was not only a threat to Malachi's life and career, but it also endangered anyone who dared to challenge the powerful forces at play. In the days that followed, Aurora dove into the investigation with a relentless determination. Late nights in the hospital's records room became her new norm. Amidst piles of patient charts, medication logs, and internal memos, she began to piece together a mosaic of deceit. There were hidden transactions, unexplained adjustments in the medication orders, and digital footprints that pointed toward unauthorized access by certain staff members. Each discovery was like a jolt of electricity, a stark reminder that someone was orchestrating this elaborate betrayal. One evening, as she meticulously reviewed a series of suspicious entries in the system, Aurora's phone buzzed. It was a message from an anonymous source, containing a single line of text and an attachment that hinted at the involvement of a high-ranking hospital administrator. The message read, "Trust no one. The truth lies in the numbers." Her pulse quickened as she opened the file, revealing encrypted logs and timestamps that suggested deliberate interference in Malachi's treatment protocols. The evidence was damning, yet it raised even more questions. Who was behind this? Was it someone within Graytech, or was it an insider at the hospital? Or perhaps the lines between the two were more blurred than she had ever imagined. Every new piece of evidence intensified the tension. Aurora knew that uncovering the truth would mean pitting herself against formidable adversaries, powerful executives, entrenched hospital officials, and shadowy figures with their own agendas. The closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. One particularly harrowing day, Aurora was summoned to a closed-door meeting by an uncharacteristically nervous hospital director. In a room devoid of the usual clinical sterility, she was met by wary glances and hushed tones. The director, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses, leaned in close and whispered, "Dr. Lin, you must be cautious. There are forces here that will do anything to keep these secrets buried. I've seen people disappear when they got too close." The warning sent a chill down her spine. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, Not only was Malachi's life in danger, but her own as well. Every step forward in the investigation was a step into a labyrinth of power, corruption, and betrayal. A labyrinth where one wrong move could end everything. Back in Malachi's suite, the confrontation with Cyrus and the revelation of the internal sabotage had left an indelible mark on both of them. Their quiet moments of shared determination now took on a new urgency. They were no longer just fighting to save a life. They were fighting to expose a conspiracy that threatened to upend entire institutions. One late evening, as they pored over the latest findings in a secluded corner of the hospital, Malachi's voice broke the tense silence. I always knew there were enemies in this world. People who would stop at nothing to bring down those who dared to succeed. But I never imagined it would come to this level of betrayal. Aurora looked into his eyes, and in that gaze, she saw not just the vulnerability of a man fighting for his life, but also the steely resolve of a leader who refused to be defeated. We have to expose them, Malachi, she said, her tone unwavering despite the fear gnawing at her. If we let this continue, more lives will be ruined. More trust will be shattered. He nodded slowly, a fire kindling in his eyes. Then we make them pay. We show the world the truth, no matter what it takes. Their words hung in the air, heavy with promise and peril. In that moment, the bond between them was forged anew, one built on mutual trust, shared danger, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The discovery of the sabotage had not only unveiled a dark underbelly within both the hospital and his company, but it had also transformed their relationship into a powerful alliance against a common enemy. As the investigation deepened, every day brought new challenges and unexpected confrontations. Aurora found herself negotiating secret meetings with whistleblowers, decoding encrypted emails, and tracing digital breadcrumbs that led to high-ranking officials. Malachi, for his part, began to assert himself more forcefully in board meetings and internal discussions, his public persona hardened by the knowledge that treachery lurked at every corner. Yet even as he presented a facade of unyielding determination, there were moments when he would catch Aurora's eye, a fleeting look that spoke of fear, gratitude, and the unspoken bond they now shared. During one particularly charged board meeting, where tension simmered beneath the surface like a coiled spring, Malachi faced a barrage of pointed questions from discontented board members. His voice, usually so commanding, wavered ever so slightly as he defended himself against accusations of financial mismanagement and reckless decision-making. It was clear that the sabotage had far-reaching implications, and those who had orchestrated it were not going to allow their schemes to be exposed easily. I have always led this company with transparency and integrity, Malachi declared, his eyes blazing with defiance. But there are those who seek to undermine me not out of concern for our future, but out of envy and greed. I will not stand by while they attempt to destroy what I've built. The tension in the room was palpable, each word fueling a growing divide between the loyalists and the conspirators. In that charged atmosphere, Aurora's heart pounded not only with professional duty, but also with personal conviction. She knew that the coming days would be fraught with danger and heartbreak, yet she also felt an unyielding resolve to see justice done. In the quiet hours after the meeting, as the boardroom emptied and the corridors fell silent, Aurora and Malachi slipped away together. In a secluded hallway, their voices were low, barely above a whisper, as they planned their next steps. "We have enough evidence now," Malachi murmured, glancing at a tablet filled with encrypted files and confidential memos. "But exposing, this will make us enemies of some very powerful people." Aurora's eyes met his, and in that look was a silent vow of solidarity. "Then we'll be ready for them," she replied, her voice firm, despite the tremor of uncertainty. "We'll gather more evidence, and when the time comes, we'll reveal the truth. No matter what happens, I won't let them win." Their determination was a beacon in the darkness, a promise that even in the face of betrayal and corruption, integrity and love could still prevail. But as they turned the corner, the echo of footsteps behind them reminded them that they were being watched. In the labyrinthine corridors of power, danger lurked around every bend, and the fight for the truth was only just beginning. As they disappeared into the shadows, the storm outside raged on, a fitting mirror for the chaos within. The harsh reality of manipulation and betrayal was now laid bare, and both Aurora and Malachi knew that the path ahead would test them in ways they could scarcely imagine. Yet, in the midst of it all, there was a glimmer of hope, a spark of defiance that promised that, together, they might just have the strength to overcome the darkness and reclaim what was rightfully theirs. In the waning hours of a turbulent night, the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within the hospital corridors. Aurora and Malachi stood side by side in a secluded conference room, a dim, quiet space far from the prying eyes of the board and conspirators. The air was thick with unspoken promises, and the palpable tension of a battle that had raged too long to be contained. Every whispered word, every exchanged glance, carried the weight of their hard-fought journey. They had unearthed secrets that shattered the veneer of power and deceit. And now, the final confrontation was at hand. "We're at the crossroads," Malachi said, his voice low and steady despite the storm raging both outside and within him. His hand gripped the edge of the table as if anchoring himself to the present reality. "They want to silence us, for the evidence we have, for the truth we're about to expose. But I'm not ready to surrender my life, or my company, to their lies." Aurora met his gaze, her eyes shining with determination and an undercurrent of vulnerability. "I won't let them win either," she replied firmly. "Every piece of evidence, every document, every overheard conversation, it all points to a conspiracy that's been poisoning your company and endangering lives in this hospital. We've risked so much already, Malachi. Now we must face them head-on." Outside, the persistent rumble of thunder and the driving rain punctuated their resolve. Over the past weeks, they had built an alliance, not just as patient and doctor, but as partners bound by shared danger and an emerging deeper connection. The revelation of internal manipulation had ignited a spark between them that refused to be quenched by the dark forces arrayed against them. Their plan was audacious. Aurora had meticulously compiled the damning evidence from the hospital's records, cross-referenced with insider documents from Gray Tech. Malachi had summoned trusted allies from his inner circle, individuals who still believed in his leadership despite the board's machinations. And together, they had orchestrated a counter-strike against those determined to see him ousted. Tonight was the culmination of their quiet rebellion. A soft chime on Malachi's tablet broke the heavy silence. An encrypted message from one of his loyal executives confirmed that the board meeting, originally scheduled for the following morning, had been canceled abruptly due to unforeseen circumstances. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Their enemies were rattled. Malachi exhaled deeply, the sound mingling with the distant echoes of hospital life. "They're starting to feel the pressure," he murmured. "Every time I speak, every time you reveal another inconsistency, it sends a shockwave through their ranks. But I know this is only the beginning. The fallout from tonight, it's going to shake things up in ways we can't even predict." Aurora moved closer, her presence a reassuring anchor in the chaos. "We have to be ready," she said, her voice quivering slightly with both fear and hope. "Even if we expose the truth and drive them out, the road ahead will be treacherous. There are still enemies lurking, both within your company and in the corridors of this hospital. And what about the trust we've built? Once we step out into the light, everything could change." Malachi reached out, his fingers brushing hers in a tentative caress, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile bond that had blossomed amid betrayal and danger. "Aurora," he whispered, "I don't have all the answers. I know that the fight isn't over, that our journey is just beginning. But I also know that I can't face it without you by my side. Your courage, your unwavering commitment. It's given me hope. In that charged moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Their eyes locked, speaking volumes in a language that transcended words, a promise to stand together against the storm, come what may. The weight of their mission mingled with the tender intimacy of their connection, creating a cocktail of emotions that was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. Outside the conference room, the hospital corridors buzzed with activity as whispers of scandal began to circulate. Rumors of unauthorized medication adjustments and internal sabotage had spread like wildfire. The conspirators, once confident in their ability to control the narrative, were now scrambling to cover their tracks. And yet, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, so too did the threat of retribution grow larger. Aurora and Malachi knew that their next steps would not only determine the fate of his empire, but also the very future of the hospital. They had to mobilize their loyal allies, share the evidence in a manner that was both irrefutable and unassailable, and prepare for the inevitable backlash from those who had built their fortunes on deceit. It was a high-stakes game with no room for error. Over the coming hours, as the storm outside began to subside, they made a pact in whispered tones, a pact to protect each other, to fight for the truth no matter the cost, and to nurture the fragile, burgeoning love that had taken root amid chaos. Their conversation was punctuated by urgent exchanges, hurried plans, and the constant background noise of a hospital that never truly slept. Aurora pulled out a small, secure drive from her bag, the repository of all the evidence she had painstakingly gathered. "This drive," she said, holding it out to Malachi, "contains everything: digital logs, encrypted emails, medication records. It's our trump card. Once we release this, they won't be able to hide in the shadows." Malachi took the drive with a steady hand, his eyes reflecting both the weight of responsibility and the quiet thrill of rebellion. "Then let's do it," he replied, determination lacing his tone. "Let's expose the corruption and bring justice to those who have wronged us." In the final moments of the night, as the hospital lights dimmed to a soft glow, and the quiet murmur of recovery replaced the earlier chaos, Aurora and Malachi stood at the threshold of a new beginning. They had defeated a formidable enemy tonight, not through brute force or violence, but with the unyielding power of truth. Yet, even as the conspirators' schemes began to crumble, an unsettling uncertainty lingered in the air. The world they were about to step into was not one of neat resolutions and clean victories. It was a world fraught with complexities, where every revealed secret carried the potential to unearth new dangers. They knew that their victory was but the opening chapter of a much larger battle, a battle for their lives, for their future, and for the very integrity of the institutions they both held dear. As dawn approached, soft light crept through the windows of the conference room, casting long shadows that danced on the walls, a reminder of the dark times they had endured and the uncertain path ahead. Aurora and Malachi shared one last look, an unspoken promise that no matter what lay in store, they would face it together. "I'm not sure what tomorrow holds," Aurora murmured, her voice a blend of hope and trepidation. "But I do know that I'm ready to face it, with you." Malachi's smile was bittersweet, marked by both the scars of betrayal and the light of newfound hope. "We've come so far," he said softly, "and I believe that as long as we have each other, we can endure anything, even if the future is shrouded in uncertainty." Their hands remained entwined as they stepped out of the room, leaving behind the echoes of a night filled with revelations, confrontations, and the fierce beating of hearts united against a common foe. The corridors of the hospital awaited them, a labyrinth of challenges and hidden threats, yet also a canvas on which they would paint the next chapter of their story, a chapter that promised not just survival, but the possibility of deep, transformative love. And so, as the sun rose, casting a pale glow over a world forever changed by the events of the night. Aurora and Malachi walked forward into the unknown. Their journey was far from over. The battle for truth and justice was just beginning, and the promise of love, though fragile, burned brightly within them, a beacon guiding them through the shadows of betrayal toward a future filled with both peril and possibility. The end of one chapter marked the start of another, where every step they took together was a defiant stand against the darkness, a vow to protect the light of their connection, no matter how long the night might last. As dawn broke over the hospital, a quiet light filled the corridors, echoing, the calm after the storm, a fragile peace that belied the turbulent journey Aurora and Malachi had endured. Sitting side by side in the softly lit break room, they took a moment to reflect on the past few weeks, a time marked by near death, betrayal, hard-won victories, and the slow, tender unfolding of a love born out of crisis and sacrifice. Their journey had begun in darkness. Aurora, exhausted from a relentless shift, had rushed into the ICU only to find Malachi Gray, a man revered by the world for his power and influence, lying on the brink of death. The beeping of the cardiac monitor had punctuated that first encounter, a rhythmic reminder of life's precarious balance. In those desperate moments, as she fought to stabilize his rapidly failing vitals, Aurora's world had narrowed to a singular purpose: saving a life that seemed as fragile as the pulse on the monitor. In the midst of that chaotic battle, when all hope seemed to be slipping away, an unexpected act of compassion had changed everything. Believing that Malachi was nearing his final breath, Aurora had pressed a tender, almost imperceptible kiss to his forehead. A fleeting act born not only of medical urgency, but also of deep, unspoken empathy. That kiss had been a quiet farewell, an offering of warmth in a sterile room, and yet it resonated with both of them in ways neither had anticipated. It marked the moment when their worlds, so different yet suddenly intertwined, began to merge as Malachi's condition teetered on the edge. The mysterious recovery that followed became a turning point. Against all odds, he awakened, his eyes slowly coming to life as if to say that fate had given him another chance. That moment of resurgence forced both Aurora and Malachi to confront a reality far more complex than the simple dichotomy of life and death. In the quiet aftermath, Malachi's gratitude mingled with a burgeoning realization. His survival was not just the product of medical expertise, but also of a human connection that defied conventional boundaries. And though the kiss lingered, as a bittersweet memory, it also ignited a spark of something deeper, a nascent romance fueled by shared danger and the quiet triumph of hope. Their path was anything but smooth. Alongside the intimate moments of tenderness, they uncovered a labyrinth of deception, a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of Malachi's business empire and the institution meant to heal him. As Aurora meticulously sifted through evidence of internal sabotage and unauthorized alterations in medication, and as Malachi faced the relentless betrayal from trusted allies, the stakes grew higher. Their investigation exposed the dark underbelly of corporate greed and institutional corruption, and every new piece of evidence was a painful reminder of the sacrifices they had made. Throughout that turbulent period, the tension between their professional roles and the pull of their personal feelings was palpable. Aurora wrestled with the ethics of letting her heart guide her, even as she was duty-bound to remain detached. Each tender glance shared in the quiet moments of an otherwise unforgiving night deepened her internal conflict. Yet, as the investigation progressed and the threat of betrayal became undeniable, the raw vulnerability of their connection offered solace, a promise that in a world rife with treachery, there could still be moments of pure, unadulterated truth. In the midst of boardroom confrontations and clandestine meetings, Aurora and Malachi forged an alliance that went far beyond the boundaries of doctor and patient. They became partners in a battle for justice, determined to expose those who sought to exploit Malachi's vulnerability for their gain. Their late-night sessions in darkened hospital rooms and secret data exchanges created a cocoon of trust around them, where love and sacrifice were intertwined with the pursuit of truth. The evidence they gathered was not merely a weapon against corrupt forces. It was a testament to their resilience and an affirmation that even in the direst circumstances, human connection could triumph over darkness. Now, as they sat together, their journey seemed to span a vast landscape, from the desperate, heart-stopping moments of the ICU to the tense, dangerous corridors where conspiracies were unraveled. They had both been irrevocably changed by the experience. Malachi, once a symbol of unyielding power, now showed the cracks of vulnerability that made him profoundly human. Aurora, the dedicated healer who had always maintained a strict professional distance, had discovered that her compassion could reach further than she ever imagined. In each other, they found the courage to defy the expectations set by their worlds, choosing instead to embrace a future built on trust, mutual sacrifice, and the promise of renewal. As the first rays of morning light streamed through the window, casting a gentle glow on their intertwined hands, they shared a silent understanding. The battle they had fought was far from over. Their enemies still lurked in the shadows, and the repercussions of their discoveries were only just beginning to ripple outward. But in that moment, they allowed themselves a brief pause, a respite, to reflect on the love that had emerged amid chaos, a love that had transformed them both. Aurora's thoughts turned inward as she considered the journey they had taken together. The loss, the pain, the sheer terror of facing death head-on had been tempered by moments of undeniable beauty. A look, a touch, a whispered promise in the dead of night. Each memory was a reminder that life, for all its fragility, was also capable of profound grace. In saving Malachi, she had not only preserved a life, but had also unlocked the possibility of a new beginning. A beginning where love, in its most honest form, could flourish despite the scars left by betrayal. Malachi, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the hospital windows, murmured softly, "We have a long road ahead of us. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I do know that this, what we share, is worth fighting for." His words were both a confession and a vow, a pledge to confront the unknown, to face the inevitable challenges that lay ahead, and to protect the fragile light of their connection. Against all odds, their story was far from over. As they prepared to step into a future laden with uncertainty, they carried with them the lessons of their past, a journey marked by sacrifice, heartbreak, and the persistent hope that even in the darkest moments, love could be a guiding force. They had learned that true strength often comes not from an unyielding facade, but from the willingness to embrace vulnerability and to trust in the power of compassion. In that quiet, reflective morning, Aurora and Malachi left the sanctuary of the break room, their resolve renewed and their hearts open to the possibilities of a new day. Their path was shrouded in mystery, the promise of a future filled with both peril and opportunity stretching out before them like an uncharted map. And as they walked together into the uncertain light, they carried with them a timeless message, that love, in all its messy, beautiful imperfection, is the most profound force of all, a force that can transform despair into hope and silence into a symphony of possibility. Their journey was a testament to the power of human connection, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, every sacrifice, every shared moment of tenderness brings us one step closer to the truth. And though the story of Aurora and Malachi had reached this chapter's end, its pages remained unwritten, inviting all who heard it to reflect, to dream, and to believe that even the most fragile hearts can find a way to mend and flourish in the light of a new dawn.